The frozen breath of death whispered across the Volga River on the morning of August 1942 as General Friedrich Paulus gazed upon the industrial city that would consume nations. Stalingrad stretched before the German Sixth Army like a wounded beast, its smokestacks piercing the gray sky like the spears of fallen titans. The Dreadlords had come to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, the gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, the key to ultimate victory in the East. Paulus, a meticulous man who had never commanded an army in battle, felt the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. Behind him stretched the greatest military machine the world had ever witnessed. 600,000 men of Army Group South, their steel helmets glinting like beetle shells in the pale morning light. The panzer divisions rolled forward with mechanical precision, their tracks churning the earth into dust and blood. This was Operation Blue, the summer offensive that would break the Soviet Union's back and deliver the Reich its final triumph. The first shells began falling at dawn, a thunderous symphony that would not cease for months. Junkers 88 dive bombers screamed down from the heavens, their sirens wailing like banshees as they delivered their deadly cargo into the heart of the city. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, commanded by General Wolfram von Rick, unleashed over 600 sorties in a single day. Buildings crumbled into dust, civilians fled in terror, and the very air itself seemed to catch fire. But in the depths of the city's ruins, something stirred that the German High Command had not anticipated. General Vasily Chukov, the defender of Stalin, stood amid the rubble of his headquarters, his weathered face set in grim determination. The Soviet 62nd Army would not yield. They would fight for every brick, every cellar, every stairwell. The city would become a graveyard for the invaders, even if it meant becoming a graveyard for the defenders as well. The battle for Stalingrad had begun, and with it, the march of the Dreadlords toward their ultimate fate. As referenced in historian Anthony Beevor's comprehensive account, Stalingrad, the fateful siege, the German forces initially believed they could capture the city within weeks. The industrial workers of the tractor factory, the Red October steelworks, and the barricades gun factory had been transformed overnight into fortress strongholds. Women and children worked alongside soldiers to build barricades from furniture, books, and the bones of the dead. The Volga River ran red with blood as the first German assault troops entered the city's outskirts. House-to-house fighting erupted with savage intensity. German soldiers, hardened by 3 years of conquest across Europe, found themselves facing an enemy that would not break. Soviet snipers haunted the ruins like ghosts, picking off officers and spreading terror through the ranks. The city's defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant not just defeat but the end of their world. As night fell on that first day, the true horror began. The Dreadlords had awakened something ancient and terrible in the depths of human nature, the absolute refusal to surrender, even in the face of certain death. September winds carried the stench of death through Stalingrad's skeletal remains. As the German advance ground to a halt in the city's industrial heart, General Paulus stood in his command bunker, studying maps that bore little resemblance to the hellscape beyond. What had begun as a swift conquest had devolved into a nightmare of urban warfare that consumed men like fuel in a furnace. The Dreadlords' advance had penetrated deep into the city, but every street corner had become a fortress, every basement a tomb. Lieutenant General Hans Dorr's 14th Panzer Corps found their mighty steel beasts reduced to immobile, trapped between buildings too narrow for maneuvering. The Wehrmacht's vaunted blitzkrieg tactics, which had conquered Poland, France, and half of Russia, were useless in this labyrinth of destruction. In the tractor factory, Master Sergeant Yakov Pavlov held a 4-story apartment building with just 24 men. The building, which would become known as Pavlov's house, commanded a crucial intersection. German assault troops had attacked it 17 times, leaving the courtyard carpeted with their dead. Pavlov's defenders had hollowed out the walls, creating firing ports and sniper nests that turned the structure into an impregnable fortress. They held it for 58 days, longer than the Germans had held France. The Soviet 62nd Army clung to the western bank of the Volga by their fingernails. General Chukov had moved his headquarters underground, deep into the sewers and basements where the city's original inhabitants had once sought shelter from winter storms. Now they sheltered from a different kind of storm, one made of steel and fire and the screams of the dying. Every night, Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under cover of darkness. The river had become a highway of death, with German artillery and aircraft targeting every boat, every raft, every swimming soldier. The 13th Guards Rifle Division crossed on the night of September 14th, but only 1,000 men out of 10,000 reached the western shore alive. Those who survived were thrown immediately into the fighting, their uniforms still dripping with river water and blood. The factory district became the epicenter of the battle. The Red October steelworks, still producing tanks and ammunition even as shells fell around the workers, was transformed into a fortress. Soviet engineers had prepared the factories for siege warfare, creating underground tunnels that connected buildings and allowed defenders to move unseen. The Germans would capture a workshop during the day, only to find it empty at night as defenders melted away through hidden passages. Captain Anatoly Kuzlov of the Soviet Marines held the grain elevator for 3 days against overwhelming odds. The massive concrete structure dominated the southern approaches to the city, and its capture was essential to German plans. Wave after wave of infantry assaulted the building, but Kozlov's men turned every floor into a killing ground. When ammunition ran low, they fought with bayonets and bare hands. When the building finally fell, only 40 of the original 300 defenders remained alive. The Luftwaffe continued its relentless bombardment, but the city's defenders had learned to live like moles. They emerged from their holes to fight, then vanished back into the underground labyrinth. German soldiers began to speak of fighting ghosts, of enemies who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. The psychological toll was immense. Hardened veterans who had conquered Europe began to crack under the strain of this endless, pointless killing. As October's first snows began to fall, both armies realized they were locked in a struggle that would determine the fate of the war. The Dreadlords had awakened something they could not control, and the city was devouring them alive. October's cruel embrace wrapped around Stalingrad like a shroud as the battle entered its most savage phase. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been bled white in the city's ruins. General Paulus received daily reports of casualties that would have broken lesser commanders, but the Dreadlords pressed forward with mechanical determination. They had come too far to turn back now. The city had become a vertical battlefield where men fought, not just for buildings, but for individual floors, rooms, and stairwells. The German 71st Infantry Division captured the upper floors of the grain elevator, while Soviet defenders held the basement. For weeks the two forces existed in the same building, separated by concrete and hatred, each waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. In the barricades gun factory, Lieutenant Dragan Vasily held the workshop floor with 37 men. The factory continued producing anti-tank guns. Even as German shells fell through the roof, workers would complete a weapon, roll it out to the defenders, and return to their lathes as bullets whistled overhead. The line between soldier and civilian had disappeared entirely. Every man, woman, and child in Stalingrad was a combatant. The Soviet strategy was simple yet brilliant. Draw the Germans deeper into the city, then bleed them to death in close combat where their technological advantages meant nothing. General Chukov had ordered his men to hug the enemy to get so close. German artillery and aircraft could not fire without hitting their own troops. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours, but they kept coming. Sniper warfare reached new heights of lethality. Senior Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev, a former shepherd from the Ural Mountains, had killed over 200 German soldiers with his Mosin-Nagant rifle. The Germans sent their own sniper, Major Erwin Koenig, specifically to eliminate him. For days, the two men stalked each other through the ruins, each seeking the perfect shot. The duel became legendary among both armies, a personal contest within the larger catastrophe. The German advance had reached the Volga in several places, but they could not eliminate the Soviet defenders. The city had become a sponge that absorbed men and material without giving anything back. The 94th Infantry Division reported that after 4 months of fighting, they had advanced a total of 1 mile at a cost of 40% casualties. Some companies had been reduced to fewer than 20 men. Food and ammunition became critical issues for both sides. German supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles across hostile territory, constantly harassed by Soviet partisans. The city's defenders were supplied by boats and aircraft that ran a gauntlet of enemy fire every night. Men fought over scraps of bread and single bullets with the same ferocity they showed in battle. The psychological toll was devastating. German soldiers wrote letters home describing a rat war where men hunted each other through sewers and basements. Soviet defenders spoke of becoming troglodytes, cave dwellers who had forgotten what sunlight looked like. Both armies were being transformed by the violence, becoming something less than human. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The German field hospitals processed thousands of cases of battle fatigue, men who had simply stopped functioning as soldiers. Soviet medical teams operated in basement bunkers, performing surgery by candlelight while shells exploded overhead. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from the impossibility of evacuation. As November approached, the first signs of winter began to appear. Snow dusted the ruins, and temperatures dropped below freezing. The Dreadlords had failed to capture the city before winter, and now they faced the prospect of fighting through another Russian winter, the graveyard of Napoleon's Grande 130 years earlier. November's bitter wind howled through Stalingrad's shattered streets like the breath of the apocalypse as Marshal Georgy Zhukov finalized the most ambitious military operation in Soviet history. Codenamed Operation Uranus, the counteroffensive would strike at the German army's weakest points, the flanks, held by Romanian and Hungarian forces who lacked the equipment and motivation of their German allies. The Dreadlords, exhausted by months of urban warfare, had become fixated on capturing the final Soviet strongholds along the Volga. General Paulus committed his last reserves to one final assault on the tractor factory, convinced that one more push would break Soviet resistance. His staff officers warned of dangerous intelligence reports indicating massive Soviet troop concentrations to the north and south, but Paulus dismissed them as enemy disinformation. The German Sixth Army had been transformed by the battle. The divisions that had marched into Russia with parade ground precision now resembled medieval siege armies. Soldiers wore layers of salvaged clothing, their uniforms patched with materials scavenged from the dead. Equipment was jury-rigged and improvised. The mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a collection of armed scavengers fighting over the ruins of a dead city. Soviet preparations for the counteroffensive were massive in scope. The Red Army had assembled over 1 million men, 13,500 artillery pieces, and 900 tanks for the operation. Entire armies had been moved into position under cover of darkness, their movement concealed by the first blizzards of winter. The 21st Army, 5th Tank Army, and 65th Army formed the northern pincer, while the 57th Army and 4th Tank Army prepared to strike from the south. The plan was elegantly simple: break through the weak Romanian and Hungarian lines, then converge at Kalak to encircle the entire German 6th Army. The Soviet forces would become the hammer, and Stalingrad would become the anvil upon which the German army would be crushed. Lieutenant General Vasily Chukov received coded orders to prepare for the relief of his beleaguered forces. The 62nd Army had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance, but they had accomplished their mission. They had held the city and, more importantly, had kept the German army fixed in place while the trap was prepared. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero, and blizzards reduced visibility to mere yards. German soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign, began dying of exposure. Medical reports documented thousands of cases of frostbite and hypothermia. The Luftwaffe's ability to support ground operations was severely limited by the weather. Intelligence reports from Soviet reconnaissance units painted a clear picture of German weakness. The Romanian Third Army, holding the crucial Don river crossings, was equipped with obsolete weapons and had no reserves. Hungarian forces to the south were similarly under strength and demoralized. The German command had spread their forces to thin, prioritizing the capture of Stalingrad over the protection of their flanks. General Paulus made one final attempt to break Soviet resistance. On November 10th, the Sixth Army launched Operation Hubertus, designed to capture the remaining Soviet strongholds along the Volga. German assault troops, supported by the last operational panzer units, attacked the tractor factory and Red October steelworks with desperate fury. They gained yards of rubble at enormous costs, but the Soviet defenders held. The irony was complete. The Germans had almost won, but their victory had become their defeat. They held 90% of the city, but that final 10% remained beyond their grasp. The Dreadlords had awakened forces they could not control, and now those forces were about to be unleashed. As November 19th dawned with sub-zero temperatures and driving snow, Soviet artillery began the largest bombardment in military history. The trap was about to spring shut. November 19th marked the beginning of the end for the German 6th Army as Soviet artillery erupted along a 200-mile front in the pre-dawn darkness. The earth shook with the thunder of 3,500 guns as Operation Uranus commenced, shattering the frozen steppe with a barrage that could be heard in Moscow. The Romanian Third Army, holding the Don River line northwest of Stalingrad, disintegrated under the assault. Romanian soldiers, equipped with weapons dating from World War I and lacking adequate winter clothing, abandoned their positions in panic. The Soviet 5th Tank Army, led by Lieutenant General Pavel, smashed through the collapsing defenses like a steel avalanche. By noon, Soviet tanks were racing across the open steppe, their tracks churning the snow into bloody slush. General Paulus received the first reports of the Soviet offensive with disbelief. His intelligence staff had detected Soviet preparations, but the scale of the attack was beyond their worst projections. The German 6th Army was fully committed to the street fighting in Stalingrad, with no reserves available to counter the breakthrough. Paulus sent desperate requests to Army Group Don for reinforcements, but there were none to spare. The southern pincer of the Soviet offensive struck the Romanian 4th Army the following day. The 57th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Fyodor Tolbukin, achieved complete tactical surprise. Romanian units fled in disorder, abandoning their equipment and leaving massive gaps in the German defensive line. Soviet mechanized corps poured through the breaks, racing toward the rendezvous point at Kalak. The encirclement was proceeding with clockwork precision. Soviet forces had advanced over 60 miles in 48 hours, collapsing the entire German front. The Wehrmacht's vaunted defensive doctrine, which had served them well in previous campaigns, was useless against an enemy who had learned to fight with German efficiency and Russian determination. On November 22nd, elements of the 26th Tank Corps met advance units of the 4th Tank Army at the village of Kalak. The meeting was almost anticlimactic to Soviet officers shaking hands over a map. While their tanks formed a steel ring around 300,000 German soldiers, the Kesselau cauldron was complete. General Paulus found himself in an impossible position. The 6th Army was trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles long and 20 miles wide, with no hope of breaking out without massive reinforcements. His men were already on reduced rations, and winter was intensifying. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the army by air, but their transported aircraft were being systematically destroyed by Soviet fighters. The German High Command faced a terrible choice: Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group D, advocated for an immediate breakout attempt while the Soviet ring was still forming. Adolf Hitler, however, ordered the Sixth Army to hold their positions at all costs. The Führer believed that German forces could break through to relieve the trapped army, but this was a fatal miscalculation. Inside the cauldron, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled to starvation levels. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with cases of typhus, dysentery, and frostbite. German soldiers began burning furniture, books, and even their own equipment to stay warm. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero and men died at their posts, frozen solid in their foxholes. The Soviet forces tightened their grip methodically. Artillery bombardments targeted German supply dumps and command posts. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies, shooting down German transport planes and bombing the makeshift airfields within the pocket. The Ring of Steel was becoming a noose. Operation Winter Storm, the German relief effort, began on December 12 under Manstein's command. The 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with the best remaining German units, fought desperately to reach the trapped 6th Army. They advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket before being stopped by fierce Soviet resistance. The relief effort had failed, and with it, the last hope for the men trapped in the Dreadlords had marched into the abyss, and now the abyss was consuming them. The trap had closed, and there would be no escape. January's merciless cold settled over the Stalingrad cauldron like a funeral shroud as the German 6th Army entered its final death throes. The temperature plummeted to 40 below zero, and the wind howled across the frozen steppe with the voices of the dead. General Paulus Gonton Holloway stood among the ruins of his command, knowing that he was presiding over the greatest military disaster in German history. The Dreadlords' mighty army had been reduced to a collection of desperate men fighting for survival. Daily rations consisted of a few ounces of horse meat and a crust of bread. Soldiers stripped clothing from frozen corpses, and cannibalism became an unspoken reality. The German war machine, which had conquered most of Europe, had devolved into something primitive and terrible. On January 8th, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky delivered an ultimatum to the German forces. The Soviet commander offered honorable surrender, promising that prisoners would be treated according to international law. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler, but the Führer's response was predictable: fight to the last man and the last bullet. The die was cast for the final act of the tragedy. The Soviet offensive, Operation Ring, began on January 10th with a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth for miles. The Red Army had learned from their earlier mistakes, and now applied pressure with methodical precision. The German perimeter began to collapse, as starving soldiers could no longer hold their positions. Each day brought new Soviet advances, and the cauldron grew smaller. The airfield at Potomnik, the last lifeline for the trapped army, fell on January 16th. German transport aircraft had been flying in a few tons of supplies daily, but even this trickle was now cut off. The last operational aircraft evacuated the most seriously wounded, but hundreds of thousands of men remained trapped in the shrinking pocket. Medical facilities had ceased to function. The main hospital, located in the basement of the Univomag department store, was overcrowded with men dying of wounds, disease, and starvation. German military doctors, trained to save lives, could only offer morphine to ease the suffering. The wounded lay in rows on the frozen ground, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. The final German stronghold was the tractor factory, where the battle had raged for months. Soviet forces methodically cleared the industrial complex, room by room, floor by floor. The fighting was savage, but the outcome was inevitable. German resistance was crumbling not from enemy action, but from the simple inability to continue fighting. On January 31st, Soviet forces captured the Univermag building and with it, General Paulus himself. The newly promoted field marshal had been ordered by Hitler to commit suicide rather than surrender, but Paulus chose captivity over death. His decision symbolized the complete collapse of German military culture. The concept of death before dishonor had died in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The last German resistance ended on February 2nd. General Karl Straker, commanding the northern pocket, surrendered his remaining forces after a final, futile defense. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, and with it, the myth of German invincibility. The Wehrmacht had lost an entire army, over 200,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The cost for the Soviet Union was even higher, over 1 million military casualties and countless civilian deaths. But they had achieved something more valuable than victory. They had proven that the German army could be defeated. The tide of war had turned, and the long march toward Berlin could begin. The Dreadlords had descended into the depths where light cannot reach, and they had found only darkness. Their march had ended not in conquest, but in the greatest military catastrophe of the 20th century. The city of Stalingrad had become their tomb, and from its ruins would rise the beginning of the end. For the Third Reich, the final reckoning had come, and history would remember February 2nd, 1940. As the day when the German war machine broke upon the anvil of Soviet determination. The march of the Dreadlords was over, but the march toward victory had just begun.